It is really my absolute pleasure to be here with my friend Marc Dollinger, who is the author of this truly extraordinary book that I finally finished. And I couldn't be more glad that we did this because it forced me. I just haven't had time to read a book in a long time. But this truly could not be more relevant. I feel like, Marc, when you wrote this book, you didn't even know how relevant it was going to be 2 years later, a year later. I mean, every sentence. I don't know if you saw my email. I was talking to Menachem Creditor about it today and how extraordinary this book is and how every sentence resonates with our contemporary culture and our politics and the divisions in it and our justice movements. And I mean, it's totally unbelievable that you were so prescient. I mean, first, just tell me about that. How is it that history repeats itself, or is it just that what made you even realize how important this book was right now?
First of all, thank you. Great to be here. Great to chat with you. I appreciate it. Now I'm going to tell you the deep, dark secret of this book. And that is, it's taken me 20 years to finish it. I kept, joke is it's my second book because my first book, my dissertation, I did on Jewish liberalism in the 20th century. I loved the 60s, so I wanted to do like a whole book on the 60s. And then other projects just kept coming up and I kept putting it off. And then finally I realized I'm going to freaking retire before I finish this book. I have to channel my inner Nancy Reagan and just say no to everything. So I pulled it out and I finished it, and then I sent it on its way, and I honestly didn't have a clue in that mindset that issues of Jews and race and racial justice and the current political climate and the left and Zionism and all of that would hype up, and thanks to people like Leah Dinello and I got onto the NPR podcasts, and the book sold out 3 times now.
It's amazing, and you've been traveling the country. Sorry, I was just updating the caption so people know what we're doing here since it's not on the Zioness page.
Sure.
You've been touring the country, talking to diverse audiences. I've been to your book talks. They're amazing. You challenge people with questions that they're totally not expecting. And I mean, how has it been received? Are you feeling the love? Are you feeling like you're being heard and you're changing conversations?
Oh, thank you. It's fantastic. It's like my professional and personal dream to get to travel and teach and talk about the book. I'm finding folks are really interested in the question and really don't want to talk about
it. They're afraid to touch it.
It makes it really uncomfortable. So there's a certain awkwardness in the room. I try to do my best with sort of humor, to try to sort of create a more trusting environment. And Alana Kaufman, joins me whenever she can with all of her work. I'll be Thursday night. I'll be in Margate, New Jersey, near Atlantic City, and then Friday I'll be at Temple Bethel, Northern Westchester, and Sunday I'll be at the Antioch Baptist Church. Giving the talk to an African American audience.
Really cool.
So it's phenomenal. I never imagined it. One of my graduate school teachers told us when we're picking our dissertations not to pick what's hot right now. Pick what you're passionate about, because it's going to take so many years to finish. You don't know what's going to be hot when you finish. And I've been working on this, and then it just dropped at the perfect time. So I'm just so grateful.
I mean, I'm so grateful for your time. We in the Zioness community are so grateful for your scholarship. I also have to say I'm so grateful for your friendship. For people who care about this, I got to know Marc over the last several years in our work on his campus at San Francisco State University, where he is the Goldman Chair in Jewish Studies. And I was involved in actually litigation against the university for anti-Semitism, and Marc was the person that I could really count on, and that the other lawyers who were involved in the case could count on to be honest with us about what was happening on campus. And way more importantly, in terms of being honest with us, Marc was the one person that the students could count on to go to, who would support them and, help them through the very challenging situations that they were encountering in terms of the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus. And you talk about it a little bit in the book with the establishment of the College of Ethnic Studies there and some of the coursework. And I do want to we'll get into this, but let's just actually start with the content in the book. Go ahead.
I want to tell a funny story about my friendship with you, if I can.
Sure. I know the story. Go ahead.
You know the story. You know what's coming. I was going to say, we all have friends that we don't see in a while, but then when we reconnect with them, it's like no time has passed, because you can just, pick up that conversation. And the first time we chatted, we had that kind of relationship, and for the people who are watching to know, that's because you got all my emails and I didn't know it, and you've been reading everything I wrote on this. So before you picked up the phone, you actually were inside my head. So I'm glad that we were similarly predisposed on all of that, and I appreciate the work that you did for our students on campus. So
thank you. It was such a privilege to get to work with you and Seth and the team at Winston and Strawn, and really proud of the outcome there. And okay, so now we get into the book. So, I mean, first I actually want to talk a little bit about the title. And I know I didn't send you this question in advance, but it's really Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. So even the title right off the bat tells you there's going to be controversy in here, that you're doing something provocative and sort of revolutionary. You're having a conversation that other people aren't having. And so that was one of the reasons that I was really drawn to the book when you actually first sent it to me, which was such an honor. And I'm very curious if you intended for it to be provocative. I know it was kind of an upending of the narrative that we in the Jewish community often tell about Jewish involvement in civil rights activism. But did you intend to be provocative, or did you intend to be academic? What was your goal when you came up with this title and when you came up, with the idea of writing this book 20 years ago?
What an outstanding question. And I'll tell you, Phyllis Deutsch at Brandeis University Press is loving you right now, because this is the third title for the book.
Oh, wow.
The first, and I'll answer your question through the evolution of the book titles. I was interested that in the late 1960s, American Jews rediscovered their Jewishness in ways that they had not until the immigrant generation came with their Jewishness. And I thought, how fascinating that Zionism takes an uptick in the late 60s. There's a Jewish religious revival, Soviet Jewry, even right-wing neoconservative Jewish movements. And I wanted to understand the Jewish turn inward. So I called the book Turning Inward, And then I start reading, and I was fascinated with this question: is it good for the Jews? And what's interesting about this question is I think Jews have been asking one another this question all the time, but they ask it in private, because never in public want to announce that you're self-interested as a Jew.
Right.
I went back to the 50s and then through the 60s and 70s, I saw that the question, is it good for the Jews, went from the private sphere to the public sphere. And then people publishing essays in national journals that are called, is it good for the Jews? And they're making that the test for things. So the book really traces the evolution of that question. And my editor, who's phenomenal, Phyllis, she said no. She gave me all these reasons why it's a bad title. So I said, great, you're the editor. Let's go back and forth. And we came up with this one. And I thought it was way too long and way too descriptive. And then the folks at Brandeis University Press showed me a mock-up of that cover. And as soon as I saw the cover, I just fell in love with the title. And what you just said is so affirming, because Phyllis explained to me, you want your thesis on the cover. Black Power, Jewish Politics makes a statement, and people will pick it up off the shelf, or at least order it online if they find it convenient. And interestingly, it's been so effective, I've had a problem with it, and this might get into what I think are some of your future questions. It's not actually a book about Black Power. It's actually a book about Jewish politics.
Right.
I am looking through the experience of white Jews in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
What kind of Jews?
Right. and so when I have African-American Christians coming to my book talks expecting to learn about the Black Power movement, and then I finish and I've only talked about Jewish politics, a few have come to me to express their disappointment.
Oh, really?
So now I sort of try to clear that up at the beginning.
Well, I mean, you talk about Black Power and how the African American community came to Black Power as its sort of force, as its movement, its defining opportunity for its goals and its aims, and why the kind of slow-mo version before Black Power wasn't working, the gradualism, as you call it. So I think it's in the book. I mean, certainly it's obviously not the whole thesis, but I learned a lot about the genesis of the Black Power movement and the various groups that made up the Black Power movement. I knew some of it, but it was you taught me a lot about that, specifically,
Well,
unique to the bigger picture.
this might warm things up for you for the future questions. This is what historians call historiography.
You love that word.
And that it's a good polysyllabic. It's the history of historical writing.
Okay.
I'm trained in American Jewish history, so I read all the American Jewish historians on whatever the topic is, and they have a set of questions that interest them, and then I'm contributing to those questions. If I'm not trained in African American history, if I were trained, I would be reading the historiography in African American history and those questions and answering them. So even though, yes, I do have to put in Black Power, I have to talk about the phenomenon, the question I ask in the book is not what African American scholars are necessarily interested in.
Right.
It's what American Jewish scholars are interested in, and that's where I have to sort of mark my lane and stay in it.
All right, so let's start with the first question. And I think it's really interesting how you sort of start the story, the prologue of the book, with a sort of humbling story about yourself and your experience at Berkeley and growing up in a suburban community outside of Los Angeles. Why did you do that? What was your goal with that? What made you start that way? I don't often see something like that.
I'll start with the joke. I didn't do that, even though I did.
Okay.
In
Marc Dollinger of you.
In graduate school, we're taught that a good scholar can write the history of any people in any time, in any place, if they do their work well. And therefore, it doesn't matter the identity of the historian. It only matters how well the historian tells the story. And if you read the book and like the book, I did a good job. If people don't like it, I didn't do a good job. And we then excise ourselves from the narrative as much as possible. We have anonymous peer review to make sure we're getting it right. And then I bumped into a scholar in African American studies at SF State who teaches communication studies. And he has his students learn how race and ethnicity inform means of communication. That's what he does. And I explained to him that in Jewish studies at SF State, I tell my students not to announce Jewish identity in the class because we want non-Jews in the class. We don't want to separate. We want everyone together. I've got Hillel, I got Jewish summer camp, Jewish day school kids. They come in a pack, and I'm really trying to build a community with everybody. And my colleague in African American studies was quite clear that I can do that because I'm a white man. Mm-hmm. And his identity walks in the room with him and walks in his scholarship. And with that, I took the challenge to mean, okay, I am a white, cisgendered, heteronormative, middle-class, white, suburban male.
You've said white so many times, my head's going to explode. We'll come back to it.
Writing a book called Black Power, Jewish Politics, I best put myself out in all the vulnerability I can to share some embarrassing stories of growing up and sort of where my head was at on racial consciousness. And then anyone who reads the book can discount what I say or count even more what I say based upon me. So I am in relationship to my book, and I have to step away from what I learned in graduate school, and it's not a neutral, detached, third-person exercise. We are all involved as much as we try to be objective in what we write. So when you read the prologue, it's growing up in LA in the 70s and sort of how I thought about race relations coming from that and what happened to me when I got to Berkeley as an undergrad.
Okay, so I was going to save this question for later, but I want to start with it and then maybe come back to it. And you know what the question is. And it is a question of whether Jews are white. And throughout the book, you cite dozens maybe of Jewish leaders from the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s and 70s who have just accepted Jewish whiteness and Jewish privilege. And I think I have absolutely no problem with Jewish privilege in terms of the fact that Jews who overwhelmingly appear in the world as white are not getting pulled over. We're not getting shot. We're not. We do not have to face the fears that members of communities of color that we want to be allies to are facing every day. the question of Jewish whiteness is a fascinating one for so many reasons, and it's one that has been very alienating to Jews in progressive spaces, which we've led, since their inception, almost every single one in this country and around the world. And the question, especially in terms of today's political paradigm, leaves Jews without a political home. And one of the things that I think is most important for people to understand is that the Holocaust was based on the notion that Jewish blood was perverting the white race, that, we're the vermin, our blood is impure. So for Jews to now be white, I totally understand where that comes from, but it is such a challenge in terms of our organizing today, in terms of the way that Jews are marginalized and the way that anti-Semitism is manifesting. So it's really fascinating, and we can come back to how that conversation has shifted over time, because it was fascinating to me in the book that every single Jewish leader was talking about Jewish whiteness and how easy it is for you to say that you're a white man, even though you are, a Jewish scholar. And I know that you're very aware of this debate. So I just found it interesting how comfortable you are, because again, I understand it. And I'm looking at us right now and we certainly appear white. That's not a question, there's no denying that, of course. And, of course, I understand the challenges that we are not facing because of that. Having said that, there are other challenges that we face as Jews that I think the whiteness conversation tends to suppress or, make people unaware that we are also a marginalized community. So if you could just reflect on that just in a basic sense, and then we could talk more about the trajectory of that conversation over the last several decades.
Well, you've asked 27 outstanding questions. And
you thought this was going to be simple, right?
I'll get started.
Your book is simple, by the way.
The best book on this is Eric Goldstein's The Price of Whiteness. He's at Emory University, for folks who are interested. Another one that a lot of people read is Karen Brodkin, How Jews Became White Folks and What That Says About Race in America. Those are kind of the two standard books. And what I'll say to what you said is yes. And what you've described is what I love about being a Jewish studies scholar. As a scholar in Jewish studies, I want to demonstrate to every other discipline that they can't understand themselves unless they understand the Jewish experience. And what you described around Jews and whiteness and racial categories is how complicated Jews make it for everybody and everything. And then you illustrated it through political alliances and the rest. So cultural anthropologists call this liminality. Liminality is the ability to operate in more than one social group at the same time. Jews are, at one point, well, most Jews, Ashkenazi white-faced Jews, are white and enjoy the privilege you were describing, yet there's the backside of liminality. If you're liminal, even though you may appear white and you may pass as white and enjoy the privilege, that white group will never, ever fully embrace you. On the flip side, Jews have suffered racial discrimination at the worst possible way, the attempted genocide of the Jewish people. This would ally white-skinned Jews as non-white racially based upon Nazi purity ideology, so we should be in natural alliance with other communities of color. And in a sense, Jews or white-skinned Jews have been some of the greatest allies historically in these social justice movements, even as, you also described, white phenotype Jews will never, ever be fully embraced by other communities of color on the left. So the good news is Jews get to move back and forth like nobody else, at least in American society. The bad news is we'll never have a home completely and at peace. So what I describe is that dynamic and how in the 60s, Jews were getting shunted back and forth on the racial divide in terms of their own self-definition, how other marginalized communities define Jews, and certainly with the work you do, how Zionism is going to just mess all of that up in 27 new directions.
I don't know what you're talking about.
As a scholar, I'm trying to describe the dynamic, to bring light to the complexity of it. So I'll leave that there.
Okay, we'll come back to it. Just a quick thing that's actually not directly, but is tangentially related to the book, just since this is a learning opportunity for people who don't know a lot about this stuff. a lot of people don't realize that in Charlottesville in August 2017, when the neo-Nazis were marching through the streets with tiki torches and screaming, "Jews will not replace us," they didn't actually think that Jews were going to procreate at a rate to overtake white Christian society. What they're trying to say is that Jews are allies to communities of color and immigrants and refugees, and that Jews are responsible for the perversion of white society because of that allyship. So what's really scary, I think, for Jews today is that, American Jews identify overwhelmingly as members of the political left, which is why Zioness has such a resonant message there. And also as proud Zionists, Jews who believe in Jewish liberation and self-determination, which is really how you define it, I think, in the book, which I love. But as you said, if we're attacked on the right for our work in supporting other marginalized communities, and then we try to go into the left to support marginalized communities, and they say you're a privileged white person that oppresses people of color and communities of color, well, where do we go then? And as you said, it means that we don't ever have a home where we're fully comfortable. I would say there's not really a home for a lot of American Jews where they're even remotely comfortable. And I would say, obviously, as I said, and as I fully believe, our home overwhelmingly is in the political left, but there is a strain in sort of coming from the radical left that has threatened to become more mainstream right now. And so I think it's so important that we try to reclaim our narrative and our story and our history and stand proudly in the space that is ours, where we feel most at home, and make sure that we feel more at home and more represented, because when Jews are disenfranchised and unrepresented, it doesn't really end well.
And I'll let you know, this is what you just described is the book I'm writing now.
Oh, perfect.
It's on campus anti-Semitism from the left and from the right, because I started my career at a right-wing campus where I actually resigned my tenure because I faced physical threats for being on the political left. And then I got to SF State, and magically I became the political right because I was a Zionist, and now I was facing it from the opposite side. And also about not having a political home, I was at Oxford over the summer for their Anti-Semitism Institute, and studied a lot about what British Jews are going through now.
Yeah.
And what you just described, I think, is even more painful in Britain, and as well as it is here, in terms of not finding a home on the left or on the right in Britain. So
yeah,
I think it's a transnational issue too.
It certainly is one, and I think the Labor Party, the destruction of the Labor Party, should be a learning lesson for all of us in the progressive left as to how not just to fight anti-Semitism, but to actually maintain the integrity of our progressive movements and make sure that they can, whether the coalitions are perfect or not is not the question. It's whether we can actually move the ball forward and advance the issues that we care about. And if we're all fighting over what anti-Semitism is and whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and whether Jews get to define our own bigotry, whether Jews are white or privileged, when Jews are showing up, when any committed activist is showing up, I would say we want more committed activists, not less. But this brings us back to your book.
Yes.
So let's go back to your book. So, okay, I think what the best thing, and you tell me if you typically do this a different way, we're already a half hour in. People who are watching, please feel free to post questions in the comment thread, either on the Zioness post or on the post on my page. And again, for people who are listening, I apologize that it's showing up on my personal page. For some reason, the Zioness page was not letting me post the video or go live. So, Marc, do you typically go chapter by chapter? The chapters are all pretty distinct in terms of topic. You obviously tie it all together beautifully, but do you think I should do some big picture questions or go chapter by chapter? And then, for people who maybe haven't read, who I want to get the book and read, I don't know, what do you think? What's the best way to organize it?
My sense is, just because we have limited time, do big picture. I've learned in my education it's better to have good quality minutes. It's less important what we're actually talking about in those minutes. So hit on the things you most need to talk about, and then we'll sort of cascade from there, however you or folks writing in want to take it.
Okay, so this is a big picture question that comes from chapter 2, which is about Jewish communal responses to the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and the social reform efforts related to the Great Society. And you talk about how before Johnson came to office, Jews and blacks were working together in a sort of colorblind, coalition to advance civil rights. And the book obviously is focused on the civil rights movement and the racial justice movement and not the broader progressive movement. But I think that there are lessons relating to the broader progressive movement that we can take from it, of course. So one of the things that was really fascinating that you talk about is that Jews didn't qualify for Great Society assistance, social justice assistance, because the Jewish community at that point was not, suffering to the extent that it needed it. But women did. And obviously, half of the Jewish community is female. So when it came to questions of affirmative action, which Jewish women were benefiting from, even though Jews weren't, Jewish women were. And so you pose a question that I'm actually going to ask you to answer because I feel like you have an answer to this. You ask, it's sort of a multi-pronged question. How can scholars understand the impact of group-based liberal programs on Jews if they acted on women and men in such different ways? What does it say about the construction of historical memory around the Great Society in the 1960s if little public discussion took place on the status of women as a designated minority group? To what extent did Jewish support for the group-based approach of Black power enjoy support from American Jewish women who better understood the structural limits of a sexist and racist nation? And I think it was such a fascinating set of questions, especially in light of contemporary progressive activist dogma, which, really revolves around intersectionality right now. And it demands that we look at various pieces of group identity and weigh discriminatory impact based on a variety of different factors. So I'm very curious if you would say, is safe to assume that this whole paradigm makes a lot of sense, like today's contemporary intersectional paradigm, whether it makes a lot of sense in light of the failures to actually look at the ways that different group-based discrimination impacted individual rights. And then as a side note, since I haven't asked enough questions in this question, but I feel like you know exactly where to take this, your book really does seem like a glimpse into the void from which intersectionality arose. And so I'm just really curious how you put all of these things together, because the fact that Jewish women could benefit in a way that Jewish men couldn't, that Jews overall couldn't. And then we look at today the way that we fight discrimination, and we talk about women and then Jewish women and women of color, African-American women, Latino women, Native women. I mean, so these different identities do come together in different ways, and you kind of anticipated that in the book.
Yeah, so let me take that in two pieces. First, we'll talk about what was going on in the 60s with affirmative action, then we can apply it to intersectionality today. That piece of chapter 2 is an indictment of American Jewish historiography, that is the way in which the story has been told up till now, and even more American Jewish historical memory, which is to say, the way we think history happened and the way it actually happened are often different. Now, when I grew up, when I was learning the anti-affirmative action argument, it kind of went like, why should my high-achieving kid not get into Harvard because a low-achieving minority kid took their place? It's the argument, it's called meritocracy. And it's a highly problematic argument, but for some in the Jewish community, it is where they went with the rise of affirmative action, and especially quotas, which happened when affirmative action programs failed. In some places, there were quotas. So Jews were not a designated minority group according to the federal government. Women, as you mentioned, were. And the second issue of Tikkun covered this, and Irving Howe, who wrote World of Our Fathers with Bernard Rosenberg, had an article with 2 sentences about this, but I have not read anywhere else in American Jewish or gender studies what it means that, I'll just say, white Jewish women benefit more from affirmative action than African Americans or Latinos because Jewish women were prepared in high school to go to college, grad school to professions. And we have invented a history which is the opposite of what happened. And it's a misogynistic read, because the moment we see affirmative action as benefiting women and benefiting Jews, it undermines the whole meritocracy argument against it. And it forces Jewish men and even some Jewish women to reflect again on how they look at progressive politics in the 60s. And it's not as simple as maybe they thought. So that was sort of the point of putting that in. And I really want to inspire scholars in women's studies more to dive deeper into that. The application to intersectionality, and here I just have to have a professional pause. I'm a historian and a scholar. I am not an anti-racism person nor a contemporary activist. So when I'm taking the history and moving it to the present or the future, it's my best guess, but it's not coming from scholarship. Yes, exactly what you said. and that is that Jewish women operating in a political sphere are different than Jewish men and have been forgotten or made invisible in the history of it. And now to say how much of feminism or being a woman is going to play into Zioness in a particular way that Jewish men or male Zionists do would be your point, right? Because the sexism and the misogyny, and by the way, even if you look at Israel studies and Zionism, the male-centeredness of Zionism itself is huge, and the way in which the modern political Zionist and labor Zionist movement played on machismo, you are in an area ripe for scholarly study, and there probably will be at some point as you go along.
I hope so. I've never seen anything like your comment on that, and I guess it's because it doesn't exist, but.
Yeah, and I'm surprised and disappointed that there isn't a gendered analysis of affirmative action in Jewish studies.
So interesting. Okay, so take it to intersectionality today and where this comment kind of fits in. Do you think that this period was foreshadowing?
Yeah, so intersectionality, of course, was invented in the 1990s as a word or phrase. I believe that it has always operated for people, because people do have, or at least in a pluralistic society where it matters that you're more than one thing. And women have certainly dealt with being women through each of the decades of the 20th century, which is my academic field. And Jewish women have also intersected with that through each of the decades. So for Jewish women Zionists to enter leftist progressive spaces with other women of intersectional identities gives an opportunity to claim the way in which, however, Jewish women Zionists are going to identify themselves and offer their perspective on what it means to be them from an intersectional place would have a parallel, right, to all of the other conversations that are going on. And as you probably understand, both Zionism and whiteness complicate intersectional identities in the way in which those are received or rejected by some on the progressive left than others, which I know that you have experienced. So.
Yes, I definitely have. And it's really interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do on this, but we have found with Zioness that actually it's not as hostile as it seems when you're not in it. Like that when we go into progressive spaces, intersectional spaces, and we say we are progressive and we are here, for example, women's movement, Slut Walk and Dyke March and all of these things that we've participated in as proud Zionists, we've been pushed out at the beginning, but when we've showed up anyway, we've ultimately been welcomed. And actually there is a real ability to change perceptions of Zionism that I don't think are often based on real knowledge. I think there's a narrative that exists that's perpetuated in a lot of these spaces without any facts behind it or, any real information. And it's sort of, there's a menu of items that you care about if you're a progressive, and anti-Zionism has sort of become one of them. But when activists who take on these narratives without knowing more about them encounter a Zioness in a space who cares just as much about reproductive justice and equal pay and healthcare, access to abortion, especially for women of color who are, facing the biggest challenges on those in that sense. When people see that Zionists who are Jews, who care about all the same things that they do, are willing to show up and battle with them for those issues, the perception of Zionism changes. So while it is complex and very challenging, it's not, I don't think that the Zionist identity is impossible to overcome. I just don't think anyone has tried owning it very proudly in some of these spaces. I hope, maybe I'm wrong, but from the experience that we've had over the last couple of years, that's where we are. But anyway, back to the book. I digress again.
I was going to say, can I jump in there?
Please.
On the book related to what you just said?
Yes, please.
If folks are interested, there's a documentary called Berkeley in the 60s. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. It might have won, I'm not sure. And it's basically history of the free speech movement. But what I find fascinating is that in the middle of a student sit-in in Sproul Plaza, which is the main administrative building on the Berkeley campus, all the students are sitting in and they're doing all the folk songs as they did back in the day. Then they start dancing the hora. and they start singing Zionist Hebrew songs. And they capture this image of these Berkeley leftists in the 60s who so connect their Zionism with their social justice work that in the middle of what seems to be a secular protest, because it's not a Jewish protest at all, they've got everyone singing Tzena Tzena, and what happened, right? So one of the things I try to do in the book on Zion, in the chapter on Zionism, is trace Israel as the socialist utopia that the American left of the 30s, 40s, and 50s loved and aspired to and made their model of what progressivism could be in the kibbutzim and the moshavim. And it was an idealized place. And then it flipped, right? It flipped with the rise of the New Left, probably by 1964, even before the 1967 Six-Day War. And now Israel became a Zionist, imperialist, colonial enterprise, which is the opposite of what it was before. And Jews, in this case Israeli Jews, went from being the good leftists creating the ideal society to becoming the white Southern racist bigots of Jim Crow. Only, instead of African Americans as the object of their scorn, Palestinians are now the object of their scorn. And after the Six-Day War is when it really intensified, because now Jewish progressive Zionists have to make a choice. And this is what I wrote about in this chapter. I have a chapter in California Jews, another book I co-edited. They've got to stick with Zionism and reformulate what they'll call progressive Zionism and figure out what that means. Or they're going to join the rest of the left and be anti-Zionist, or as my classmate at Berkeley, Brenda Landau, and I credit her, as she would be arguing on Sproul Plaza on Zionism back in our undergraduate days. And one time she's involved in a heated debate. And as a joke, she turns to me and says, everyone's allowed one double standard. Mine is Israel. And then she turns around and continues the debate, illustrating the fact that she was friends with everyone on the left on every issue except when it came to Israel and Zionism, because in the mid-60s, they flipped, and she didn't flip. And talk
Did
about
she believe it
liminality.
was a double standard, or was she just?
She was having fun with the fact that she was making a Zionist claim to a progressive leftist at Berkeley who didn't think Zionism was progressive, and she did.
Okay, so she didn't actually believe it was a double standard. She was joking about the double standard.
She was having a little bit of humor in a very tense moment,
It wouldn't.
But it's as if it's a double standard. That's what she's saying, and I think that's what Zioness is facing right now, too.
Well, that's why Zioness exists, literally, because Jews facing that false choice end up staying home, and then they end up disenfranchised, like I was talking about before. It's not like most Jews, when they're faced with the choice of being members of the left or being Zionists, will say, okay, I'll go be a member of the right. I mean, it's not like they're finding a political home there. So if they don't have a place where they can be proud Zionists and committed to all of the domestic social justice ideals that, they grew up with and that, matter to them and that feel immediate, that feel of immediate concern to them, then they will abandon a core component of their identities. And that in itself is a huge problem and is anti-Semitism. Yeah. So the reason I was asking about whether your friend actually believed it was a double standard or was joking, I asked because I could see her saying, I believe it is a double standard to support Israel and be a progressive, and yet I do. I'm happy that she was joking and she knows that supporting Israel and being a progressive are absolutely, mutually empowering. I am a progressive because I am a Zionist, and vice versa. My Zionism is informed by my progressive values. So, and vice versa. Anyway, it's all just so interesting. So I forgot, there was a question that I just wanted to ask you, and I forgot what it was. It was related to something you were saying. About the fact that Jews felt like they had to make this choice. And I guess we sort of talked about it already because you said this is what Zioness is addressing. But do you feel like we've actually made progress on these issues? I mean, do you feel like there's any difference on one hand, and you talk about this with regard to campus in the book, about how Jews being informed by Black power were turning inward and actually being very empowered to build Jewish community institutions and, to kind of return to Jewish peoplehood and Jewish faith and commitment to Jewish values that they had sort of abandoned in the more, colorblind society of before the Black Power time period. And I was just laughing, given our experience together of fighting anti-Semitism on college campus, and the experience of so many American Jews who are doing this every single day on college campuses, some of the most elite academic institutions in history, where Jews can't wear Jewish stars or yarmulkes on campus without fear of being either attacked or ostracized. And in the book, you talk about how in the 60s, Jewish student groups were flourishing and Jews were talking about Jewish power, having been inspired by Black power. So in that sense, and I want you to talk about the inspiration, the Black power inspiration for Jews, but I also want you to talk about how unbelievably different the situation is now. And I guess, you talk about a span of 10 years and the gigantic difference in the way that the alliance is manifesting. But so now if it's 40 years or 50 years later, I mean, where Jews are in terms of their comfort in being proud Jews and proud Zionists is just a totally different world. So wherever you want to go with that.
Yeah, so the answer is generational. And sort of I'll go all the way back to 1948. The generation that lived through World War II and the Shoah and the creation of the State of Israel in terms of their Zionism, it was informed by those events and stayed with them forever. Their children went through the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and the real palpable idea that there could not be a State of Israel on two occasions in a matter of just a few years, and that held them. And I'll quickly answer today, and then I'll go back. The current undergraduate population does not have a foundational relationship or experience from which to root or ground their Zionism. Mm-hmm. In fact, the opposite. They're rooted and grounded in an anti-colonial leftist ideology which links Zionism with racism and has platform on American campuses. Now, Birthright is probably the best example for this generation in terms of sort of a massive event that's creating personal direct connections to Israel. For whatever complications folks have with Birthright, I'm speaking as an historian. That was an invention that was a very, very big deal. My book ends in 1975 or 1980. And so what was going on in the late 60s and the 70s is that even as Black nationalists became largely anti-Zionist and in some cases anti-Semitic, and there's a whole lot of anti-Zionist stuff that was coming out in SNCC, the sort of the Black Radical newsletter, what Jews took from that was, we're going to be stronger Jewish nationalists, because if there can be Black nationalism in America, there can be Jewish nationalism in America. So the irony is that it was actually anti-Zionism that fueled an increase in Zionism. And this is where Jewish studies programs and departments were started on American universities. And this is where sort of in the street political activism got started. And I ended 1980, the epilogue sort of fills in the last 20 or 30 years. But sadly, this is how recent history is. The difference between 1980 and 2020 is forever. That's a different. I'll just say that's a different book, and maybe that's a poli-sci current events book more than history at this point.
Well, it's like 17 books.
What's that?
It's like 17 books.
Yeah, the journey of those that came of age in the 60s and reinvented progressive Zionism in the late 60s and 70s are already parents or grandparents to our current undergraduates in terms of the political climate that they are experiencing and the way in which allyship on the left has coalesced around the notion that Zionism is racism, and therefore the only way to be an anti-racist is to be an anti-Zionist, and that is an unfriendly place for a Zionist student to want to publicly articulate themselves. Not to mention, I have to tell you, socially, you're socially marginalized with people. This is the liminality again, right? The more one wants to promote their belief in Zionism, the less chance they're going to invite it to whatever the event is. And as you know from your work on our campus, this happened to our Hillel, where they were excluded from a student fair explicitly because they were Zionists. And this was done unanimously by students and faculty and administrators. And when the investigation went on, they bragged about it. So that's how invulnerable they feel they are to critique for that particular position.
So something that I've been thinking about, and I was thinking about while I was reading the book, but now as you're speaking, I'm thinking about it more, that if Jews as whites, perceived whites, and I'm not really weighing in on this conversation. It just is a conversation that I don't think can be ignored. The question of whether it's okay to call Jews white. Um, Again, I understand it. It just, I know that the history and our social reality, conflicts with it. But anyway, if Jews as perceived whites are not welcome in intersectional coalitions and social justice activism, why are anti-Zionist Jews who look the same as Zionist Jews welcome? How is the whiteness overcome by opposition to Jewish peoplehood?
It's
Is
a
there an
political
answer to
litmus
that?
test. It's
Okay.
a political litmus test. If you want to be cynical about it, as happened on my campus, literally with the work that you were doing, if one admits an anti-Zionist white Jew, then one can claim not to be anti-Semitic and not to be anti-Jewish, however we wanted to define that. So it serves a utilitarian political goal. That's one piece. Second, there is in leftist ideology a notion that all people should be together in the cause, and all oppression is related, and we should all fight against one another's oppression. So if you believe that, and then here's the kicker, you believe Zionism is racism, then you open up the avenue for Jewish anti-Zionists to be brought into a larger coalition to fight against injustice, while keeping Zionist Jews on the outside. And the case made on my campus, as you know, is that Jews aren't permitted into this space because other student communities feel that physical assault would be inevitable if that happened. Therefore, to protect vulnerable students, Jewish students or Zionist students aren't permitted in the room. So the argument they're making is not an anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic one. It is a protect ourselves from the racism that is Zionism. And if SF State is against racism, SF State must, by definition, be against Zionism. And then you must take actions to keep Zionists off campus, which was a campaign we had, as you know, for over a year, that Zionists were not welcome on our campus after Mayor Barkott was shouted down. So I think it's
Are they welcome now?
What's that?
Are they welcome now?
Hold on, yeah, we have a new president
I
and
know.
basically an entirely new administration, and we're looking a whole lot better now.
And a settlement.
I'm optimistic, and a path-breaking national settlement which holds accountability for that.
Yeah, but so I mean, I hear you and I agree with every single thing you said. But what about the sincere Black nationalists who really believe that the African American community should be leading the African American civil rights battle, and that Jews and people who look white and whites and anyone else who wants to be a great ally but isn't Black and has not suffered the systemic oppression that African Americans have faced should not be leading in these movements? And so Jews were marginalized, seen as white. And as you talk about in the epilogue, there was a very simple binary, Jews and Blacks. And, you talk in the epilogue about how Jews of color exist and, how the whole paradigm is upended by that conversation. But there was, I think, a sincere conversation happening that Blacks should be leading the racial justice movement, the civil rights movement. And so Jews weren't welcome because Jews didn't look like that. So Zionism, I understand, came in, because of the Palestinians and because of the colonialism and, all of those arguments. But still, I still don't really understand how a white appearing Jew who says, okay, I'm anti-Zionist, could be welcome in these movements looking the way they did. I get it as the excuse, that it's not anti-Semitic, but that seems more contemporary, no? Was that happening in the 60s and 70s also?
So you are coming from what we would call the American Jewish historiography. While I'm not trained in African American, I know enough about it to give you another view.
Okay.
And that is that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Frederick Douglass, 1856. The notion here is, as much as good allies believe and want to be good allies, there is a limit to liberalism generally. There's a limit to white liberalism, however you want to define that, and to white Jewish liberalism.
And you call it paternalism in the book. Or you say that it was seen as paternalism.
Right, and paternalism is part of its limitations. And so here's where you're going to get, I think, really upset. But I think it's, but not with me, but just
I'm ready.
the truth of history. Dr. King made a decision. His decision was allyship across racial and religious lines is a good thing. Not only for whatever Christian religious theological view it is, but also, to be honest, politically. If black folks are getting killed, sadly, the media won't pay attention, but when white people get killed, they will. And this is actually how SNCC was able to vote in favor of bringing white college students down to the South, because they understood that this is actually how they're going to nationalize what is seen as a regional issue. I was raised in the 1970s with King's vision of interracial alliance, that it is really good to be arm in arm, as that famous picture of King and Heschel and Selma shows, right? What happened with the rise of Black power first, and what we're seeing, I think, across the progressive left now, is a rejection of allyship across perceived racial lines, I'll put it that way, which is to say, the moment white folk are engaged in struggles for communities of color, there will be a limit and that cannot go beyond, and therefore either you bring allies into a certain point, or, to be honest, if you really want to achieve your goals, it needs to be only with those communities. Now, my daughters are college age, one's graduated and the other one's in school now, so they kind of share with me their experiences. So as a parent, I'm sad, right? Because I see my daughters, who are sort of engaged, active Jews, Zionists, progressives, going into those spaces and getting the rebuke. And I'm like, okay, well, when I was your age, for the most part, it was a really good thing to want to step across a line and reach out. So, some of the quotes I have, even from the 60s in the book, call this a transitional phase. You know, that we start with King, we move to Malcolm and Stokely, and then eventually we're going to get back to bringing everyone together. Others are more cynical and just don't think it's possible to bring change by what they would call selling out, you know, to the dominant culture. And we really have a very stark leftist, rejectionist view among some that has no place for Zionists or white Jews who they perceive as white.
Right. So fascinating. So for people who are watching, I'm assuming probably a lot have not read at least the full book. I think everyone really should. I hope this isn't a spoiler alert, except it is, because this is a book club, so we're talking about the book. But basically the thesis is that we, the Jews, tell a story of Jewish civil rights activism that we've internalized, I think, as a community, and that we really believe. It's not with bad intentions. It's really the way that we have seen our involvement over the last 50 or 60 years in the civil rights struggle, and with the best of intentions. But I think, as you would say, historiographically, maybe, as if I did that right, maybe it's not exactly as we see it. Maybe the situation is not exactly as we see it, and that there were challenges, and as you say, they were foreseen by Jewish leadership long before they manifested. So you talk about the challenges and the divisions that occurred, which seem to be totally predictable in the Black Jewish Alliance, but then you talk about something that people really don't think about, which is the way that Black power, including the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in it, inspired the Jewish community to Jewish power and to reclaim Zionism, to be proud Zionists and proud Jews, and to actually live the lessons that Black power was teaching its own community, for our own community, which had lost a lot of our power, and we had become so assimilated and you know, so universalist as opposed to particularist. So I would love for you to just reflect a little bit about whether your thesis has been well received by the Jews who have told ourselves this story. And I'll say just a quick thing that I talk about a lot, and I'd love for you to reflect on this specifically. I find that a lot of times when I'm talking about Jewish activism and our commitment to racial justice, that Jews who want to blame the African-American community for not standing with us now and for adopting BDS in the Black Lives Matter manifesto, et cetera, always love to invoke Heschel. It's always Heschel, but Heschel. And I'm like, where were you And where were you in Ferguson? And where have you been? Because we can't expect people to be there for us if we're not there for them. So the Heschel thing, as proud as I am of the Heschel legacy and of the Joachim Prinz legacy and of the Jews who, fought the legal battles and paid for the legal battles and sat on the buses and sat at the counters and did all that and marched over the bridges. I mean, all of that. I'm so proud of the Jewish legacy of civil rights. But it's not that I think we're overselling it. I think that we really don't understand it. So it's another reason why your book is so revolutionary about the limitations of the Jewish commitment to the civil rights struggle then, and how maybe we can learn from that history to do it better now, which is certainly the goal of Zioness.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'll start with the window I had was the Soviet Jewry movement, because I did that as a kid, and I accidentally, when I was writing my dissertation, found out that they were using a lot of civil rights movement strategies in the Soviet Jewry movement. So that was sort of that got me interested into the question. What shocked me when I was in the archives, and what I do in my book talks, is the fact that what I described in the book that is so surprising to my youth was actually not surprising even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That the sources I found were national Jewish leaders saying what I said in the book publicly. So what happened is that in the last couple generations, we kind of forgot that. And my scholar friends who wrote on this, didn't pick up on that from the stuff in the archives. So I'm flipping through these speeches and these essays and these sermons that rabbis are making. And I'm saying that they are arguing a different history that I learned growing up in the 1970s. So it's actually really bad, that we flipped it. So what I do with folks is, and so if people are listening, they come to a talk, they have to tell me because I'm going to put them in a different group. I give them quotes from these historical figures, but I don't tell them the year it was done or the person, and they have to guess. And it's designed because they always guess totally wrong. So how do people respond? They respond well because they predicted from what they grew up thinking was right, and then they actually read the document, and then I get a lot of gasping, and a lot of good reactions. Heschel is really where it's all focused. When Heschel marched, he was repudiated by his fellow Jews. He was marginalized at his seminary. He was perceived as not doing Jewish work by being in civil rights. So the memory of Heschel and the actual Heschel are different. And Heschel's daughter, Professor Susanna Heschel, is at Dartmouth now. She's a Jewish studies professor, and she reviewed the book for one of the journals, which of course made me nervous because I was afraid that she would see my thesis as disrespecting her father. Thankfully, she liked the book, and she understood that I'm actually trying to put her dad into an accurate historical context, which recognizes the risks that he took. And when you were just mentioning all the contemporary examples, if Jews aren't engaged in risk in ongoing relationships in order to develop a sense of allyship and credibility, then the fear will be that we're going to sort of go back to our suburbs and continue on with our lives by ourselves.
Right. And it's not, I'm not asking Jews to do it unilaterally, but we do want a two-way street. And I think it's a sincere commitment of Jews to be involved in these issues. And I'm not interested in blaming, is it our community's fault? Is it the Black community's fault? I'm just not interested in that. I think we need a reset. And I think we've all been talking about the division for more than 50 years now. And I think, to the extent, I totally understand the arguments that you make, not necessarily on behalf of the Black Power leaders, but on behalf of, not on behalf of anyone, but the historical and academic arguments as to why Black Power happened and the limitations of the kind of liberal gradualism that you talk about. I totally accept that. I will say there are sincere allies in the Jewish community that want to take direction. Zioness doesn't want to lead on racial justice, but we want to show up wherever we can make a difference. And so I do think that there are Jews who have been feeling like they're not welcome to participate, and that's why they haven't been participating, and perhaps they've been feeling that way for a very long time. So I hope that, Zioness can inspire them and empower them to show up, and I think that's the best way that we can build back a coalition, again, by taking direction from the people who are most affected, but definitely not by staying home. And actually, you mentioned Susanna Heschel, and I was talking about her today, again with Menachem Creditor, who's so fabulous and has a million books that everyone should also be reading, and also is a friend of Marc's, I know, and was very excited that we were doing this talk. And he told me that Susanna Heschel had actually talked about the movie Selma and how Rabbi Heschel was not in it. And do you know this story?
Yeah. Well, I don't know this. I don't know Menachem's story, but I know that I know
You
about
know
the
this
Selma
story.
movie.
I think I had heard it, but Menachem reminded me of it today. It's not a Menachem story, it's just that he reminded me of it. That Heschel was left out of Selma and played a gigantic role in the march from Selma to Montgomery. So it was obviously offensive to the Jewish community that he had been sort of erased from something that he played such a, enormous leadership role in. But that Susanna Heschel had said, yes, it's offensive. Yes, I'm disappointed to see that he was erased from the story. However, he never intended to be the center of the story. He never intended for the civil rights struggle to be about him or his leadership. And as you said, Marc, he really was ostracized from the Jewish community. And it's so ironic given how lionized he is today by our community, given his role and his leadership on this issue. So if that's the case, then for us to look back and point at him as the excuse for why we're not active now, that we should have so much gratitude for what he did then, even though he didn't have, he definitely had Jews marching with him, and there really were lots of Jews who were leading on this, I think, totally outsized impact of the Jewish community in the civil rights struggle. However, it's not like every Jew out there was showing up and fighting for this. So we have a legacy to build on, and I'm very proud of our community's legacy on that, but there's still a lot of work for us to do. And I think we have to do it as Zionists because, as I said, I think that when we show up talking positively about Zionism and what it means to us as Jews and the fact that it is progressive and that it is consistent with our progressive values on other issues, and also something that I think is really important, which affected me in the book, it's a conversation that I have a lot, with the Zionist lens, is that the Black Power movement was anti-Zionist because of the Palestinians, because they, believed that they, the Palestinians are the marginalized community, and so they had to stand with the marginalized community, as if they couldn't believe that both Israel and a Palestinian state would exist, as if there was a binary there. And this is a challenge that we face today also, all the time. And it's simply not real, as you know, because most Jews believe that Israel should exist and also that a Palestinian state should exist. So the thought or the belief that Jews who are Zionists shouldn't be welcome because of the Palestinians, this might be a controversial thing to say, and I'm actually really curious your thoughts on it. I don't think we've talked about this, but I talk about a lot how deeply offended I am by people who say, white people, or even, white passing people, who say, I can't support Black Lives Matter because it means white lives don't. I hear people say this. We've heard people say this since Black Lives Matter launched. I can't support Black Lives Matter because it means white lives don't. And I say to them, Black Lives Matter is about the lived experience of Black people in America. It has absolutely nothing to do with white people. And if you can't say Black Lives Matter, that's a problem. That's just objectively a problem. By the same token, Zionism is about Jewish people. There are geopolitical consequences to the manifestation of the Zionist dream in the contemporary state of Israel that are above my pay grade as an American Jew. But for me to believe that Israel should exist and that Zionism is my people's history and story and narrative, and the only thing uniting the Jewish people in the diaspora for thousands of years is our drive to Zion, and therefore I am a Zionist because I am a Jew, people need to understand the same people who want everyone to say Black Lives Matter, and I am with them. I believe that we should all say Black Lives Matter. We should also say Zionism is Jewish liberation and Zionism matters. Not to say, not to all lives matter it at all. Black Lives Matter is about the lived experience of Black people in America, and Zionism is about the lived experience of Jews for thousands of years. And I think we should be able to say both. I think that also we should be able to say that Zionism is not incompatible with Palestinian liberation any more than Black Lives Matter is not incompatible with other people also having rights in our, constitutional democracy or whatever we used to have of one.
So I will say that I have a litmus test to sort of respond to what you're doing, at least on my campus and when I'm kneeling. I ask the question to whomever would be articulating this anti-Zionist position. is there in your mind something called progressive Zionism?
Mm.
Can you be progressive and Zionist at the same time? If the answer is no, then it is a fundamental rejection of the Jewish people's right to national self-determination. And that's problematic from a leftist perspective, because you are excluding a group, which one is not supposed to do. And it challenges the idea of what I see mostly happening on college campuses, which is a flattening of the definition of the word Zionism to equate itself with revisionist Zionism and the current government. And therefore, that becomes what Zionism is for everybody. And I know that the students on my campus spend a lot of time educating their classmates, from marginalized communities, that what they're hearing about Zionism is a particular form of Zionism. It's not the one that they believe in, and it's not the overarching idea of national self-determination as an inherent right of any and every people, and that all leftists should, of course, support it.
So two things, and I want your thoughts on them. The first one is, I get a question all the time, can you be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? People always want to know whether I think that's possible. And my answer, and actually I think it's consistent with leftist dogma, is that if you don't believe in states or borders, if you're, one of those people who is sort of anarchist, but just, believes that borders are by definition discriminatory or, lead to conflict, and you don't believe that there should be states whatsoever, and then you don't think there should be a Jewish state, totally cool. That to me does not raise any flags. But if you think there should be states and you don't think there should be a Jewish state, and you can't explain why in a way that is consistent with your disagreement with the existence of any other state on earth or delegitimization of any other state, then you have an anti-Semitism problem. Having said that, I actually would push back, and even I've had this conversation also with students on your campus, where I don't need someone to say that they believe in progressive Zionism. And actually, I don't think Zionism is political. And I know that people would disagree. And I know that Herzl's version was political. And, I know Jabotinsky's version was political. But Zionism and the way it's demonized, the way that Jews are demonized as Zionists, I don't think is about Herzl or Jabotinsky or any of the other Zionist thinkers. I think that Zionism is Jewish peoplehood, and it is the fact that we are the children of Zion. And we talk about at Zioness the fact that Jews can be Zionists whether they love Bibi or hate Bibi or are ambivalent to the politics and policies of Israel, or they could know absolutely nothing about the politics and policies of the state of Israel and still be proud Zionists because they know that Zionism is Jewish self-determination. So I don't think it's about progressive Zionism. I wish personally that Israel was a more progressive state. I wish that the politics of the contemporary state were more in line with my progressive values, but I don't vote there. And I do what I can to try to push that. But I think that domestically in America, American Jews who want to be progressive and want to be Zionist, I don't want them to need to pass a litmus test on whether their Zionism is progressive Zionism, if that makes sense. Because I don't think that's what Zionism is, progressive or conservative, or, I think Zionism is just Jewish liberation.
Right. So it all depends on how you're defining Zionism. And if you go up to Jewish liberation, then we can not have to deal with all the different varieties of it. First of all, asking if anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic is an impossible question instantly. To begin with, I have a definition of anti-Semitism, which is scholarly, and it's problematic to use it in popular discourse. It's really a problem in political, because the moment it's used, folks can come up with some sects of Haredi Jews that are anti-Zionist for theological reasons, and they would not be anti-Semitic. The Reform movement of American Judaism was anti-Zionist for a long time. Of course, it was a different form of anti-Zionism in a different time period than we have now, so we can argue that's not the same as we have now, because in fact, now we do have we have a Reform Zionist group.
Shout out Josh. We did a Facebook Live with him last week.
Oh, great. Right. So therefore, the moment that you can come up with really good Jews who are anti-Zionist, that you can't do it, then and that's not really what you're talking about. I think what you're talking about is intent and motive of those claiming anti-Zionism. Are they really anti-Semitic? and that line is practically speaking the most challenging. On my campus, and I think I've talked with you about this before, I'm looking for an anti-Semitic trope tied to anti-Zionism. Because if you're looking at, for instance, we had it with the term Zionist power that was going around campus. Zionist power is code for Jewish power. Because when you connect the notion of power to Zionism, it's power to Jews, and that is a classic anti-Semitic trope from the Protocols of Zion, and that's anti-Semitism. So you can't say that. If one believes in national self-determination for everyone except the Jews, that's a problem, because that's articulating something anti-Jewish against everything else. So I tend, when it comes to anti-Zionism, to know that the devil is in the details, and I always go to the specific example the person is talking about and come to a determination rather than try to go to something broad, because then we're off in left field and there's nowhere to go. It's just a practical issue I have in conversations.
Okay, I get it. I'm with you. We could debate this later. Because obviously the Haredi issue poses a challenge to the anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism conversation, but I don't think that everyone who perpetuates anti-Zionist messaging is necessarily harboring actual anti-Semitic views. But I think that by perpetuating anti-Zionist messaging, they are also perpetuating anti-Semitism, often without knowing it, without knowing where the narratives are coming from. And actually, this is a question that I have for you, and it's 10:17. Are you fine with time?
I'm good.
Okay, me too. And I don't know if it's because the Facebook Live is on my personal as opposed to the Zioness page. No one has asked questions, but if anybody wants to ask questions, please do. And I have to check again on the Zioness page, but. Shoot, I just forgot what that question was that I was going to ask.
Something about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Shoot. I lost it. Okay, so hopefully will come back to me as I'm just ending with this very powerful piece. Actually, no. Before I get to this, I want to go to the epilogue, and then I want to go to chapter 6 to close on chapter 6. So the epilogue. Can you talk a little bit about why you wrote the epilogue, and what players inspired you to reflect on the book as you had written it?
Yeah. So when you write a history book, especially in the more contemporary period, you got to have an epilogue that brings it to the current day. It's not a scholarly chapter. You don't have to research it. There's no primary sources. And since I kind of ended about 1980, the editors, the press wanted me to go from 1980 to the present. And I was like, oh, this is going to be boring, because there's no argument when you're just covering what's happened since you finished your book. And then I went out for lunch with Ilana Kaufman, who is a friend of mine and now the creator and leader of the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, which is an incredible organization doing fantastic work for Jews of color. And this was during the Selma II March. 50 years later, the Union for Reform Judaism and the NAACP were recreating the famed Selma March. And Ilana was giving me a lot of critique on the march and a lot of critique on my book. And she was right. So at the end of this lunch, I got my theory for the epilogue. So historiography says that every generation of historians look at a historical moment in their own lens. And which means, like, I'm saying that everyone who came before me are idiots and I'm the smart one. And 20 years from now, they're going to call me an idiot. So I wanted to get ahead of it by having an epilogue that called myself out. So my thesis in my book was, Jews thought they became more Jewish in the late 60s by doing more Jewish things. In fact, they were being more American, because only in an America of the 60s were they permitted to be more Jewish. In fact, it was actually the rise of Black power and Black nationalism that had Jews be Jewish, and I thought that was interesting. And Ilana said to me, so I say Jewishness is really Americanness. That's my thesis. And Ilana said, Jewishness is whiteness. It's white supremacy. It's privilege. You wrote, she said to me, 200 pages on blacks and Jews, and none on black Jews. what happens if you go through each of your chapters from the perspective of a black Jew? Now, I've got to reframe the whole book in order to see the way in which what was really going on was Jews entering racial privilege, or at least white Ashkenazi phenotype Jews, and having that form their political views. Because as Alana mentioned to me, look at the Facebook pictures from that march. White Jewish rabbi, black NAACP member holding the Torah between them. That's the classic image. Alana's like, where am I in that image? Where am I in that history? And I'm like, damn, that's the next book. The next book is got to be from the perspective of Jews of color. I'm not the one to write that because I don't see it. And working with Alana and others,
you see it.
I'm trying to see as much as I can.
It's really, and I thought that the epilogue was such a powerful way to close because all of the history, all of the scholarship, all of the research on this exists in the same binary frame. I hope that Alana, it's amazing that she called you out. It's so incredible because it's such an important point that she was making. But I hope she wasn't blaming you. I hope that she was blaming history and scholarship, which is
it's a problem. Blame. See, yeah, thank you. But that was the preface, the prologue that I put in. I am who I am, and I express my life experience, right. And I did it in 200 pages. So the prologue warmed everyone up, and then the epilogue says, okay, here's where I'm limited, and I just can't tell that story, and now someone else needs to pick it up.
Is there scholarship on that? Like, are there books about Black Jews and their involvement in the civil rights struggle and like where they identified?
There is a small and emerging historiography in Jews of color, African American Jews in America. UC Davis professor just did a book about 2 years ago on it. Lots of articles on it now, and it's the next historiographic moment.
And you talk about, and I'm familiar with the study, a recent study that said that 20% of American Jews identify as Jews of color. And so until our community is representing that and welcoming all of those people, no matter, how they look and identify, and making sure that everybody in the Jewish community has a home in our community, this conversation, this sort of alienation of a large segment of the Jewish community, I think will reflect very poorly on the way that we engage civically and socially and politically and otherwise. And I know we're trying, to make sure that Zioness is representative. I know that, you include Alana in your book talks, and it's fascinating to watch the two of you speak together. I really appreciated seeing both of you in New York last year. So one thing I wanted to ask you to do just as like a tease, and I would love for you to talk about, I think you already mentioned where you're speaking next. But if you mention that again, you said Margate, New Jersey, which as a Philly girl, yes. I'm very familiar with Margate, New Jersey. Lucy the elephant. I hope you're going to go have some, a little frolic with Lucy and have some pizza at the greenhouse next door. But I wanted you, because the questions that you pose to the audience in your book talks that always surprise people. I know you couldn't do it because we don't have a live audience, but I would love if you could give an example, if you have any off the top of your head, of the kinds of questions you ask. And I'm sure I won't get it right either, even, being familiar with your thesis. But I just think I want people to sort of see how you engage your audience at your book talk, because it really is an amazing book talk.
Okay, I got the book here. Hold on, I'm going to see if I can find the quote, page 27 and 28. So I build them up. And this one I usually give if it's a rabbi, I give this one to the rabbi. So here's a quote, and then you have to guess who said it and when. I am tired of the philanthropy of rich white men towards your race. You need to fight your own battles with your own leaders and your own money. We white men of whatever faith cannot fight your battles for you. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with you, but we will do that only until you can fight as generals all by yourselves.
So this is cheating, actually, because I remember this. I don't remember the answer.
So I will say that sounds like a Black Power era, mid-1960s, notion that white Jews are going to be purged because now African Americans have to take control of their own movement. And it's Joel Springarn, 1914, the founder of the NAACP.
Yeah.
So 50 years before Jews were shocked by Black nationalism and its impact on their alliance. And what the book is, it connects 1914 to 1964 to find out nobody was surprised by this. Everybody was describing it. And as a consequence of that, the surprise that we have in our historical memory is invented, and it's not serving us well.
Okay, so I know this is not your job, but I'm going to ask you a hard question, which is, where do we go from here? Because your book was so illuminating in the challenges that both communities face in terms of working together. And I think that in large swaths of both communities, there is probably real desire to work together. But in terms of actually effectuating the goals of racial justice, criminal justice reform, and obviously, fighting anti-Semitism also, we need to be, I think, in relationship with each other. But it's hard, and I think everybody knows that and nobody's questioning it. But where do we go from here with all of the lessons that you've learned? And this is not a scholarly question, although I would be happy for you to answer it, from an academic perspective. With everything that you've learned in researching this book and just, trusting your judgment as I do, how would you recommend that Zioness activists engage in our activism with respecting this history, respecting the way that the Black community has tried to move forward, and what they ask of us or don't ask from us or don't want from us? I don't know, just give us some guidance.
All right, so thank you. I'll speak just personally on this one, and that is self-reflect more and talk less. That's a general statement to good-minded Jewish liberals who are engaging themselves in spaces that may not be as friendly as they might want them to be. And the first thing I tell folks in audiences is just take a deep breath and just self-reflect and listen to what's happening. Imagine there are multiple narratives going on, that your narrative is certainly valid for each of us, and it's not the only one in the room. So be quiet, self-reflect, and don't talk. Now, for me as a man especially, that's even harder, and I do my best in the New York talk. I did my best the one you came to, and I have found that I grow more through a process of reflection and listening, and just literally sometimes putting my hand over my mouth just to stop myself from what I know is white fragility, which is, I can't believe you said that, just take a deep breath. And the next is, and this goes to Heschel, and I also wanted to say that there were Jewish heroes in the civil rights movement. And my first book and this last book are sometimes misread to undermine them. And I don't, because those that went and risked are heroes to me as a scholar and as an historian. I'm speaking of the gazillion people who didn't go down, who claim that they did, and are making a case for it. I think in terms of sort of white Jewish liberals, is someone who risks their own power and privilege for the benefit of another. And the moment we show willingness to risk power and privilege, that's where trust comes. And I think that has to begin with self-reflection, listening, and not talking. And then being in relationship, building relationship over time, and showing. So, I fought this in Pasadena for anti-Semitism. I fought this up at SF State. And I noticed in terms of those who allied with me and protected me, and then those that I wanted to make sure that they were protected. Once you risk your own privilege to help somebody else, it is such a powerful way to connect with another person. And those people that I have are in my heart and soul forever, because, my dean down in LA lost her job because she supported me. And that's risking power and privilege. And she's my favorite forever over that. So to whatever extent we can draw those kinds of connections around action, I think is where it gets real.
Okay, so last question, then I want to read this quote from chapter 6. it's Iowa tonight. And I'm not going to ask you to make predictions because that's really outside your pay grade, even though I would love to hear your predictions. There may be information now that we've been missing in the last hour and a half that we've been chatting. But something I kept thinking about throughout the book, as the book was talking about the failures of gradualism, liberal gradualism, and looking at legal protection, but not actually social protection, and affirmative action and making up for past wrongs, and actually doing the work of ensuring equality. And I just kept thinking to myself, is it a fool's errand, to fight beyond gradualism? Does it make more sense for us to invest in long-term change, a commitment to long-term change, or should we be doing more that is perhaps more radical? And I don't like to use the word radical, and I don't mean should we in the sense of like what's going to be more effective, but I just mean it's so fascinating as this election season is unfolding to see where America is on this. And I guess I'm curious whether you think that Black Power was effective in changing the paradigm to the extent that they wanted it to after the advances of the civil rights movement. So, reflecting on that, whether Black Power was effective, and whether today we're looking at the same question of whether we want someone slow and steady or we want someone who's going to really shake things up.
I'm growing close to power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Frederick Douglass's quote from 1856.
We're back to that.
I think Black Power succeeded. You're supposed to get more conservative as you get older. I'm actually going the other direction. I think gradualism happens only when more radical or revolutionary movements force it to. So if you're going to define the left far, far, far to the left, then the whole society will move more towards the center or more to center left, because now one is being able to define something that nobody likes, so you just go over to there. The notion of white gradualism and the notion that people don't really like to give up power and privilege, I find to be really a powerful organic force, and I think Black Power succeeded. By the way, I talked about Jews. Latinos had their version of Black Power. Women certainly did. LGBTQ did. And so there's more and more scholarship on how Black Power informed a lot of ethnic, racial, gender groups in the late 60s. Without a radical push, either for itself or for what it does to move over. And I'll just say, in Israeli politics, back in the day, the PLO, Fatah, was the most extreme. And now it's seen as a centrist because we have, Hamas, and it's and Islamic Jihad now has put Hamas into the center. So this is a process by which the presence of someone on any radical extreme will tend to move everyone in that direction, even if they don't achieve what goals they want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I worry, and this is now totally off topic, but I worry about extremes on both sides. That if we're just getting tugged between the extremes, then we're not actually...
They work both ways. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so actually I realize there's one more question before I get to closing with this quote, and I just want to go back to the question of Jews as white. And whether you think that conversation has shifted, whether the Jewish community has demanded that it shifted, or that it do shift, or that it shift, whatever the grammar that I just messed up, over the course of all of these years. It sounds like this was not a conversation whatsoever in the 60s and 70s. The Jewish leadership never even, questioned whiteness. And now I think it's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people. And I think that, Jews, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, Latino Jews, don't see themselves as white at all, and see themselves also as part of a marginalized community given their ethnic identities. And then, of course, the intersection, if we want to, go back to intersectionality of their Jewish identities, marginalized from progressive spaces as Jews. But, and I feel like this is also for someone like Ilana Kaufman, a big challenge where she feels alienated from the Jewish community, which is seen as white and privileged. And then also there's anti-Semitism in the African-American community. So how do we look at this question of Jewish whiteness from a scholarly perspective, and also from your Marc Dollinger perspective, just as a sensitive Jew?
Yeah, it's generational. You're right. This was not the language, of the mid '60s. Race is socially constructed. on all sides. So you were describing all sorts of different kinds of Jews who don't self-perceive as white. Yeah, this also goes to the liminality part of it. I think that my sense is that my undergraduates pretty much aren't contesting the privilege that white Jews enjoy. And for better and for worse, in other words, their life experience has not been someone who lived through World War II or someone who's lived through a Mizrahi experience. Like those who you claim are claiming that they're not white are claiming it for a reason, because they have an identity and a life experience that they're entitled to have, because you get to define yourself. If we want to look sociologically, I do see a growing embrace of the notion of white supremacy and white privilege, and the fact that American Jews have done extraordinarily well in this society in the last 50 years, if not the last 80 years, and for that reason, enter into progressive circles in a different place. And then just sort of close it off. I get invited by Jewish organizations to come in and teach their lay leaders on Jews' whiteness, power, and privilege. The professionals, who tend to be sort of master's degrees, 20-somethings, they get it. Like, whether they agree or disagree, they understand the dynamic. The folks who sit on the board and the donors, they're the ones, who are coming from an era where Jews were not white, and they don't consider themselves white. And I'm there to sort of catch them up with where we are now. Ultimately, as a scholar, I sit in the thick of its complexity, because I think that's a gift that we as Jews offer to everybody else, to say, don't be reductionist in how you understand identity. And I teach anti-Semitism at SF State, and I'm working now, to get this course worked into race and resistance studies kinds of courses, because I think it's vital for students to see that anti-Semitism is a racist, race-based discrimination against Jews, even though they may in 2020 not see it.
Right. I would say just a quick thing, because you said that Jews who identify as white, it's based on, or don't identify as white, either way, it's based on lived experience. And I would say my lived experience, I think, would be as a white person for sure. It's not that I don't identify as white because of my lived experience. I don't identify as white because of the history of our people and the fear that I have of being grouped in with a group that doesn't welcome me.
Right. That's liminality right there.
That's liminality.
Exactly it. Yeah.
And that's really scary. So for people who are following Charlottesville and following the shootings, in the synagogues in the Tree of Life, which is based on the relationship with that shul and Hias, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the work that Hias does to, relocate Syrian refugees, just for example, that a white supremacist would attack Jews because we work with communities of color and because we are so very much not white in their eyes and so not welcome in white society. For us to self-identify as white, again, I think it just depends on what space you're entering. In the left, in progressive spaces where you're fighting for racial justice, it makes sense for Jews who appear as white to acknowledge the privilege that we have as, as people who appear as white and don't face the same challenges that people of color face. Having said that, I wish we could all sit in the complexity the way that you do, and to be able to look at this with a little bit more nuance.
Well, here's the activist part of what you said, because you describe it as scary, and it is scary. And I gave it at my synagogue. I gave a sermon one night on the topic, and I said, yes, this is scary, and it's also redemptive. In other words, the flip side of the fear is that Jews are the ones who can do the work, because we can move between these different groups, even though none of them will welcome us and both of them will threaten us. And that's, in a sense, that's a legacy, right? That's the opportunity for a legacy, because no one else can do it.
No pressure, fellow Jews. No pressure. Okay, so the thing that I kept saying that I wanted to come back to is this section on page 167 and 168, and it's American Zionism AIDS Black Power. And basically, as I said, the whole thesis is that you talk about how, the American Jewish legacy in the civil rights movement is not exactly how our community sees it now. And that American Jewish leaders foresaw Black power, supported Black power, including the Nation of Islam, actually sort of whitewashed some of the anti-Semitism in there because of the sympathy that they had toward the African American community and the need for a more aggressive form of civil rights activism that also was led by African Americans themselves and not by, Jews or anyone else. And then you talk about how Black power came back and supported Jewish power in a way, even if, very ironically. And so one of the ways that you close before the epilogue is by talking about the many African American icons who supported Zionism and stood up in spaces that were hostile to Zionism within their own communities and stood with the Jewish community on this issue and fought for Israel. And Martin Luther King was one of them, even though I know that's a more complicated legacy than sometimes Jews like to talk about. But one of the ones that I thought was the most fascinating that you list is W.E.B. Du Bois, and you wrote that he wrote, "The African movement means to us what the Zionist movement must mean to the Jews, the centralization of race effort and the recognition of the racial fount." In the post-war years, Du Bois later argued Zionism developed into a practical necessity given the refusal of most nations to settle Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. Then you talk about Marcus Garvey, saying that you say he commented on a new spirit, a new courage among Black nationalists that has come to us simultaneously as it has come to other peoples of the world. Focusing specifically on the rise of modern political Zionism in the 1920s, Garvey punctuated, "When the Jews said we shall have Palestine, the same sentiment came to us when we said we shall have Africa." And then you say J.W.H. Eason proclaimed old glory. "When you come back, won't you cry aloud and recognize Palestine for the Jews officially, Ireland for the Irish officially, and Africa for the African officially?" And it just is so amazing. The American Jewish Yiddish press called Garvey's Black nationalist anthem, "Ethiopia, thou land of our fathers, the Negro Hatikva." People don't know this. When we talk about the anti-Zionism in a lot of these spaces, we don't talk about the courageous leaders who stood up not just against anti-Semitism, but actually very expressly for Zionism and used it to advance their own Black power narratives and their own understanding of self-determination and liberation. So if you could reflect a little about that, Roy Innis, the national director of CORE, reminded his constituents that Jews caught in Egypt in the time of the Pharaoh did not talk about revolution against what was the most powerful and formidable military machine of the time. They talked about liberation, separating themselves from the Egyptians. We Black nationalists, too, must speak of separating ourselves. And you say that in terms of leading their own movement for liberation, as the Jews did with Zionism. So as a takeaway, since we are called Zioness, is there a hopeful message to be taken here about the possibilities?
All right, now I got to end hopeful. So here's the thing.
Good, right? To end hopeful.
The book is how Black power influenced Jewish politics. When you do that, inevitably the editors say, go see what you can find in the flip, in the reverse. So anytime in the archives I could find something, I put it in. So you read a bunch of those. Du Bois, who was the first African American to earn the PhD from Harvard, wrote The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. He was the leading Black intellectual of his era, and Garvey was in the 1920s. So what I'm saying is all of these people were in the era where Black Jewish allyship was seen as a positive. And it gets more challenging after the rise of Black power with anti-Zionism, because now Israel went from being the proud leftist utopia that Black nationalists and secular American leftists want to be like. I did find Stokely Carmichael, the leader of the Black Power movement, quoting Hillel. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? He didn't say he was quoting Hillel, but I went down to Stanford and met with the editor of the King Papers, who's written on Black-Jewish relations. And I said, do you know that quote? Do you think he knew he was quoting Hillel? And he says he knows he was quoting Hillel. So it's surprising and a bit affirming. To answer your question, it's all about whether the progressive left is going to see allyship across racial or perceived racial lines to be a positive development in the direction that the movement wants to go, or whether or not it's going to take an anti-normalization or a rejectionist approach, which is basically to say nobody who has not shared our lived experience could possibly help us. Here I will self-define as a classic Jewish liberal and say, I liked it when we held hands and sang a song and got a T-shirt. That was my era, and I understand that the world in which you and Zioness are operating in will have people who are there, people who are utterly rejectionist on that, and folks that perhaps you can develop relationships with over time and work together.
So there's possibility for something positive.
I always want to end with a nechemta with the positive on the end.
So I quoted the people from earlier, but if I continued, there were Carmichael quotes, and you said specifically that he really softened later. I think after some of his more controversial Black Power.
Malcolm X made the Hajj, and then when he came back, he retreated from a lot of his earlier anti-Semitism.
There were Stokely Carmichael quotes too, no? Not just
Stokely Carmichael also, but Malcolm X is sort of the most famous for being vehemently anti-Semitic, and then later in his life, before his assassination, sort of turned.
I have just so much underlining in here that I can't wait to go back to. I learned so much from this book. Feel so lucky that I got to talk to you about it. I'm sorry that people didn't send questions. I hope it's not because the video is on my personal page. But I am going to see, we'll send this out to our email list and see if people have questions that we didn't answer. And maybe I can send them to you and we can record something else and send them. But I really hope that everybody picks up this book. It is special. So meaningful, not just historically, but in terms of our contemporary zeitgeist. I think it's something that I wish that every Jew would read this. I really do. I think we would be so much better informed on how to engage today if we understood our history a little bit better. So thank you. Thank you for your time. I kept you for 2 hours.
I appreciate it. It was great. My brain hurts in the best possible way. So thank you very much.
Marc, thank you. I will talk to you very soon.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.